welcome to another instalment in my Questions About Anne Boleyn series. I'm Claire Ridgway, I run the Anne Boleyn Files website, and I've also written some books on Anne Boleyn, including this one, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, A Countdown. Today's video is inspired by a video I did, I think, back in 2011 on Anne Boleyn's appearance, and I sort of looked at portraits and some documentary evidence we have about what Anne looked like. And I'm just going to expand on that a bit more today and sort of bring it a bit more up to date with research that I've done. So I'm going to be answering the question, what did Anne Boleyn look like, as far as I possibly can. Now, in his 1585 book, Rise of the Anglican Schism, Catholic recusant Nicholas Sander described Anne Boleyn in the following way. Anne Boleyn was rather tall of stature, with black hair and an oval face of a sallow complexion, as if troubled with jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, and on her right hand 6 fingers. There was a large wen under her chin, and therefore, to hide its ugliness, she wore a high dress covering her throat. In this, she was followed by the ladies of the court, who also wore high dresses, having before been in the habit of leaving their necks and the upper portion of their persons uncovered. She was handsome to look at, with a pretty mouth, amusing in her ways, playing well on the lute, and was a good dancer. Now, as I noted in an article that I wrote on the Anne Boleyn Files website, that description sounds like Sander is describing Nanny McPhee, that famous role done by actress Emma Thompson, rather than the woman who caught the eye of King Henry VIII in the 1520s, who he pursued for many years, who he bombarded with love letters, who he asked to be his official mistress, and then when she said no, offered her marriage. And a woman who was also a catalyst for the break with Rome. Henry just turned England over to get her, to have her. It just doesn't match, does it? Now, as I pointed out in my video on whether Anne Boleyn actually had 6 fingers, and I'll give you a link to that, we can dismiss Nicholas Sander's description of Anne Boleyn for the following reasons. 1, he was writing nearly 50 years after her death, so he's not a contemporary account. 2, he was still a child when she died in 1536. It is thought that he was born between 1527 and 1530. 3, there's no evidence that he even saw Anne Boleyn. 4, he was a Catholic in exile writing Catholic propaganda in the reign of the Protestant Elizabeth I. 5, he was against the Reformed religion Protestantism, which had taken hold in England as a result of Henry VIII breaking with Rome. 6, he was hostile to Queen Elizabeth I. The church bells are ringing out their, the opposition to his description. So he was hostile to Elizabeth I, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, all, people that he saw as Protestants. And 7, his description is not corroborated by any others. He was biased. His purpose was to blacken the name of Elizabeth I and her parents, and especially her mother, who he held responsible for the Reformation and all the trouble that it caused. Now, I think it's likely that Nicholas Sander was inspired by a hostile account of Anne Boleyn's coronation procession, which took place in 1533. The account was once in a catalogue of papers in Brussels, but has since gone missing. The anonymous writer stated, "Her dress was covered with tongues pierced with nails to show the treatment which those who spoke against her might expect. Her car was so low that the ears of the last mule appeared to those who stood behind to belong to her. The letters H.A. were painted in several places for Henry and Anne, but were laughed at by many. The crown became her very ill, and a wart disfigured her very much. She wore a violet velvet mantle with a high ruff of gold thread and pearls, which concealed a swelling she has, resembling a goiter. Now, this is the only contemporary account of Anne Boleyn having a wart or a goiter. And as Professor Eric Ives points out in his biography of Anne Boleyn, Anne's coronation outfit would probably have covered her neck anyway, if it was like the surcoat and mantle that her daughter Elizabeth I wore for her coronation. And chronicler Edward Hall, who was a contemporary source and who was on the ground in England, described Anne as wearing a surcoat of white cloth of gold, a mantle of the same cloth but trimmed with ermine, and a coif with a circlet of rich stones. He makes no mention of a dress with pierced tongues or a particularly high neck, and surely someone would have mentioned her wearing such an outrageous outfit, such an outrageous dress. And how could this anonymous writer have seen her neck, any swelling, a goiter, anyway? Now, I often see that hostile description from Brussels being attributed to Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, but he did not write it. It's by an anonymous writer. Chapuis's account of Anne's coronation procession and the pageants that were part of it is not a glowing account. He compares the pageant to a funeral, describes it as cold, poor, and most unpleasing sight. But he certainly does not give Anne a wen or a wart or anything of that sort, or say that she wore that dress. So this Brussels account is not corroborated by ambassadors like Chapuis or by chroniclers like Edward Hall. So I do feel that we can dismiss it. Sander mentioned in his description of Anne that she brought in high necks to the court of England, that she made these high necks fashionable. Well, that simply isn't true. We know that's not true. High necks came in much later, in the 1530s, when Anne was queen. The low square necklines that you see in the portraits of Anne, they were in fashion, and in fact Anne's chest and her neck would have been on display. And even had she worn, her bee pendant or a choker, I'm sure that you would have noticed, or people would have noticed, a swelling or a goiter. So I think we can safely rule out the idea that she had this swelling, that she had a projecting tooth, that she had a wart, that she had an extra finger. But then that leaves us with the question, well, if she didn't look like that, what did she look like? Well, I've found some contemporary descriptions for you. We have Lancelot de Carle, who was secretary to the French ambassador at the court of England. So he was there in London when Anne was queen. And he wrote a poem about Anne's life, her rise and her fall. And in it, he said, and it was written in French, so this is a translation that I've had done. She was beautiful and her figure was elegant, and her eyes were even more enticing. She knew how to use them as is due, sometimes keeping them at rest, other times sending a message to convey her heart's secret expression. And without doubt, such was their power, which forced many to defer to her. So beautiful, an elegant figure, and these eyes that managed to convey things to people, that seemed to draw people in. In February 1528, Anne Boleyn was described by a Venetian who was apparently repeating advices from France. So what he heard from France about her, and of course Anne had spent many years in France serving Queen Claude, the Queen Consort of Francis I. And this Venetian described her as very beautiful. Then we have a report of a conversation Helwegen of the Emperor's Council of Brabant was having a conversation with John Barlow, Dean of Westbury. And Barlow was asked how Anne Boleyn compared to Henry VIII's mistress, Elizabeth Blunt, who, of course, had given the king a son, Henry Fitzroy. Here is the record of the conversation. After this, I asked him whether he knew personally the girl by whom the king had had his son, and this present lady, who he said was so much in favour with the king, whether they were pretty or handsome, and whether they were worthy of the king falling in love with them and abandoning his own wife. The dean answered that he knew both the lady and the girl. The latter, he said, was prettier than the lady, but this one was more eloquent and graceful, more really handsome, and especially of a good family. Now, the original report was written in French, and the original French for how Anne's looks were described there is complètement belle, meaning competently beautiful or beautiful enough. So he's not saying that she was stunning. He was saying, yes, she's beautiful enough for the king to, have been attracted to her, for him to want to put his wife of so many years to one side. Now, the next description is from theologian Simon Grinet of Basel. He wrote in a letter to reformer Martin Bucer that Anne was young, good-looking, and of a rather dark complexion. Then, in October 1532, in a summary of the interview between King Henry VIII and Francis I, which took place in Calais, Henry took his sweetheart Anne Boleyn on this trip. We have Venetian diplomat Francesco Sanuto, who said of Anne, "Madame Anne is not one of the handsomest women in the world. She's of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful, and take great effect on those who serve the Queen when she was on the throne." So again, those eyes are being mentioned, which I find interesting. Now, you might think that, why am I focusing on these descriptions of Anne Boleyn when there are so many portraits of Anne Boleyn, in museums and galleries, and when you Google them, there are just stacks and stacks of portraits. So can't those portraits help us answer the question, what did Anne Boleyn look like? Well, no, not really. As is clear from the multiple portraits we have of the Tudor monarchs, like the multiple portraits we have of Henry VIII, and also important courtiers, Tudor portraits weren't so much about having an accurate depiction of what that person looked like, unless you're Holbein, because I do find Hans Holbein the Younger's work to be very photographic in its quality. But Tudor portraits were more about following a certain style, and with the monarch and consort and important people, about propaganda, about image. So not really accurate depictions. And then there's also the fact that none of the portraits associated with Anne Boleyn are contemporary. They come from a lot later. Some of them, like the National Portrait Gallery one, the one that we all know and love, is from her daughter Elizabeth I's reign. The only contemporary images we have of Anne are the 1534 lead medal, which is damaged. It's in the British Museum, and it's damaged. It was made of lead, and it's damaged in the nose area because of the softness of the metal. We have a cartoon-like sketch of Anne Boleyn, which I absolutely love because it is very cartoony. And that was done for her coronation banquet seating plan. So it's just a rough sketch of where the Queen's going to sit. So it's just like a smiley face. It's brilliant. I'll give you a link to see that. So that doesn't help either. And then there's possibly an illumination in the 1534 Black Book of the Garter, which depicts the Lady of the Garter. And I think she's wearing an AB medallion. So it is thought that that this could be Anne Boleyn. So I'll give you a link to read my dear friend Roland's article on that and why he believes it to be Anne. It is fascinating. But they're not particularly helpful images to allow us to come to a conclusion over what Anne looked like. Now, stone carver Lucy Churchill did a wonderful job reconstructing the 1534 medal and replicating it and fixing the damaged nose. So I don't know whether my assistant can zoom in on that. I think all we can tell from the medal is that Anne had a long, oval, narrow face. Perhaps Eric Ives also believes that it shows her with high cheekbones as well. So she didn't have a round face, it was very long and narrow, but we can't really tell much more from that. It doesn't give us any clues about her hair, her colouring, nothing. Now, George Wyatt, grandson of Thomas Wyatt the Elder, the famous Tudor poet, and also a man who was thought to have been in love with Anne Boleyn, George Wyatt wrote a treatise defending Anne Boleyn's reputation in the late 16th century. Now, he was obviously not a contemporary of Anne, he was writing much later, but there were enough people alive at the time around him to let him know what Anne looked like. He was also supposedly drawing on, family information, and he says at the start of his treatise that he got information from a lady who served Anne Boleyn and that was close to their family, and it's thought that was Anne Gainsford, one of Anne's ladies in waiting. In his work, George talks of Anne's rare and admirable beauty, and then goes on to say, "She was taken at that time to have a beauty not so whitely as clear and fresh above all that we may esteem, which appeared much more excellent by her favour passing sweet and cheerful." Then he also wrote of small moles incident to the clearest complexions, as well as some little show of a nail on the side of one of her fingers. So he's going with the idea that Anne didn't have this pale complexion that was seen as attractive in those days, which corresponds with that swarthy, sort of darker complexion that we hear about in the other descriptions. And he also says about her having moles, and perhaps that's what led to some people describing her as having a wart, and then not a sixth finger, but something, a nail, an extra growth of nail or something on the side of one of her fingers. Now, in 1876, obviously a lot later than we're talking about, restoration work was done on the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. Now, Anne Boleyn, after her execution, was buried in the chancel of the chapel. And the chancel floor, the Victorian team were doing restoration work on the chapel, and they were trying to leave the chancel area because obviously important people like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, various dukes, were, people that had been executed had been laid to rest in the chancel, and they didn't want to disturb their remains. But the floor was sinking, and they ended up having to exhume some remains. And all of their work was recorded in a book by Doyne C. Bell. This is an antique copy of it. I've even got an inscription from 1882. The book is called, and it's one of those really long titles, Notices of the Historic Persons Buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, with an account of the discovery of the supposed remains of Queen Anne Boleyn by Doyne C. Bell. And in it has got all the reports, minutes of meetings, memoranda, all sorts to do with the restoration work and the remains that were found. And in it, we have a report that they found some remains, the remains of a woman, where it was recorded that Anne Boleyn was buried. These remains were examined by Queen Victoria's physician, a pathologist, Dr. Frederick Wyatt, who stated that they belonged to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. Then, in the memorandum, he gave further details. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square, full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. And in another report, he also gave her height, well, an approximation of her height based on her remains, saying that she was between 5 feet and 5'3". Now, of course, we don't know for sure that these remains actually belonged to Queen Anne Boleyn, but they were where the team expected to find them. So there is a high probability that they did belong to Anne. But this still doesn't help us all the way, does it? What about her hair colour? Now, Lancelot de Carle, in his poem on Anne Boleyn, describes the point at which Princess Elizabeth is born, Anne and Henry VIII's daughter. And he says, a beautiful child of pure colouring, whose looks very much resembled her father's, certainly more than her mother's, the Queen. So he's saying there that Elizabeth had pure colouring. She had fair colouring like her father. Now that sounds like she had the Tudor pale skin and the golden or red hair rather than being like her mother. So that suggests that, Anne had darker looks and perhaps was dark-haired. Now this is corroborated by Thomas Wyatt the Elder, who, as I said, at one point appears to have been in love with Anne Boleyn and knew her well. He wrote a poem called Brunette and Phyllis. Now, we know that Brunette refers to Anne Boleyn, that's her part in the poem, because as Nicola Schulman notes in her biography of Thomas Wyatt, he originally wrote in the poem, "If thou ask whom, sure since I did refrain, her that did set our country in a roar." So he is talking about Anne Boleyn. Now, brunette or brunette must surely imply that Anne had dark hair, that she was a brunette, particularly as the other woman in the poem, who this brunette is contrasted with, Phyllis, is Wyatt's mistress, Elizabeth Darrell, a woman he had a son with, who we know to have been very blonde. So we have this contrast with Phyllis, the blonde, and Anne, the brunette. Now, dark brown, almost black, is the hair colour we see Anne having in portraits like the Hever Castle portrait of Anne holding the red rose. But then we have a sort of different shade of hair colour in the National Portrait Gallery, one of her, and also the stunning, it's one of my favourite ones of her, the stunning miniature by John Hoskins. There, I think you could describe her hair as being chestnut or perhaps auburn. But then that doesn't mean that she didn't have dark brown hair. Many women have dark brown hair with reddish tones. Like before my hair started going grey and I started highlighting it, my hair was dark brown. And in the summer, when the sun got to it, I used to have red highlights in it, lovely golden highlights in it. I think those came from my mother, who was a real redhead. So Anne could have been like that. She could have had dark brown hair that did have sort of red highlights in it. So putting the contemporary descriptions together, along with the 1534 medal and along with the pathologist's reports of her remains, I think we end up having a woman who was of average height for her time, someone with a long oval face, an olive complexion rather than the kind of porcelain complexion that was so fashionable at the time, a wide mouth, small breasts, dark eyes that seem to have some kind of magnetism about them, and dark hair, possibly with sort of reddish tints to it, and perhaps some moles on her skin. And also elegant and beautiful, but not as beautiful as others, seems to have been the general thought on her. So although she didn't fit the ideals of beauty at the time, which was probably the golden hair, the porcelain skin, there was something about Anne that attracted Henry Percy, Thomas Wyatt, and Henry VIII. And look at what happened with Henry VIII. Look at what he did, to have her. Now, when I picture Anne Boleyn in my head, because that's what I do when I'm talking or thinking about Anne, I have her in my head. I think of Geneviève Bujold from Anne of the Thousand Days, with her dark eyes and her long dark hair. But I'm wondering if you can comment below with how you think of Anne. Is there a certain actress that you think of when you hear the name Anne Boleyn? Is there a certain portrait that springs to mind when someone says Anne Boleyn? I'd love to know your idea of Anne Boleyn and what you think she looked like. It's a very open question, isn't it? What did Anne Boleyn look like? I don't think we'll ever really know unless a lost contemporary portrait, we do believe there is one, unless that comes to light, we'll just be left trying to answer this question. I hope you've enjoyed this video today. I'll give you links for some more articles and videos in the description. You can subscribe to this channel by just clicking that button there, because I'm going to be doing more questions about Anne Boleyn, hopefully helping you with some answers. And you can hit the bell as well to be notified. Thank you for joining me. I will see you soon. Bye bye.